Hello, everybody, and nice to be back with you today. And I will start with a brief apology. There may be a lot of background noise to this lecture. I'm going to do my best to keep it down, but things are not entirely under my control. There's a big wedding that is occurring today, and I happen to be close to the middle of the storm. A lot of people gathered at my house, and I've tried to stake out a little bit of quiet time and space. We'll see if it works. Having said that, let me jump right in. And I want to continue the themes we started talking about last week. And if you remember, and I'll refresh your memory in a moment, we were talking about the way in which if you shift your vantage on contemporary American politics, you end up with two, I think, radically disparate perspectives. And the short-term perspective on American politics, I have to say, does not look particularly good. I will try to document to you today. There are substantial forces that have hold of one of the major American political parties that seem to be increasingly hostile to electoral democracy as such. So obviously, that is not a scenario that one hopes for in a mature electoral democracy. This is sometimes referred to as democratic backsliding. Initially, we thought of this as a phenomenon that was characteristic of immature democracies, and now the United States, the most mature, the longest established democracy in the world, seems to have similar trends besetting it and potentially undermining our democracy. So short term, things are quite frightening. Long term, I want to suggest that there are important trends that are underway presently that could be extremely, profoundly transformative, and that might give rise, in fact, to a much better era in American politics. And so maintaining that balance when I speak with you, I often emphasize the short term. Today, last week, next week, I want to shift focus more to that long-term perspective by putting the long-term and the short-term in dialogue, in the hopes that that results in a more balanced perspective and helps us to see not only the risks, but also the potentials contained in contemporary American politics. And as I explained to you last week, I'm turning to two books in order to really situate and orient my effort to do this. One of them, Heather McGhee's The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. And to be brief in reintroducing McGhee, she is the former head of the public interest research group, Demos. And after resigning as the head of Demos, McGhee spent a couple years traveling across the country, and she did so to search for two things. On the one hand, evidence for what racial zero-sum thinking is doing to our politics, the failure to cooperate across the racial line, she suggests, makes all of us worse off, makes our society worse off, means that among the most developed countries in the world, we have the least generous provision of public goods in our society. The metaphor displayed on the cover of her book is the public swimming pool that is drained rather than being integrated, right? And so that's one thing McGhee is looking for. How are we damaging ourselves by refusing to cooperate across the color line? But the other thing that she looks for, and I think the more edifying, more hopeful, in a sense, that the thing that is more neglected in mainstream coverage of the news in American politics these days, is the evidence that actually interracial cooperation and collaboration is occurring in American politics and is, in fact, resulting in the benefits of positive sum, of growing the pie, of working together in order, instead of beating each other, to create a symphony, if you will, a collective work in which all of us benefit. And I won't go into too much detail in the examples, but whether it's community revitalization by welcoming migrants from Western Africa into Francophone regions of Maine, or working together to combat the local power structure and the environmental hazard that it represents for Richmond, California, or combating predatory efforts on the part of the real estate and banking industry in Georgia and South Carolina, McGhee finds lots of evidence that at the local, the regional, even the state level, interracial cooperation, interracial or multiracial democracy is starting to work and starting to deliver benefits in some of the most diverse areas in the United States, and that this, in a sense, represents the prospects for the future as the US continues to diversify. So that's a brief reintroduction to Heather McGhee, and then Robert Putnam, a very eminent contemporary political scientist who, in his recent book, The Upswing, How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again, Putnam really synthesizes his extensive corpus in political science in order to give us a picture of what he sees as the long arc of American politics over the last 125-ish years, going from being a much more individualistic, competitive, unequal, polarized society at the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th centuries, to being a much more cooperative, collaborative, solidaristic, other-oriented, equal society in the middle of the 20th century, and then descending again into a more competitive, I-oriented, selfish, narcissistic, he would say, culture, society, economy, polity in the 21st century, not just to present that overall trajectory, but much more importantly, to try to indicate the kinds of political, economic, social, cultural developments that generated the period of political, social, cultural history that we should be proud of, and then to discern whether or not we might be able to do it again, whether or not, in fact, there might be forces already at work in American society that are difficult to detect, but perhaps with the benefit of understanding the way these forces worked last time, we might be able to better understand their current implications, right? The idea that there are incipient forces at work today that 20, 30 years from now may bear fruits, even if today they are dividing, polarizing, fragmenting, fracturing us. So very quickly to review McGhee and where we left off last week, I think the really important diagram here is to notice, and it represents an idea that although there's an increasingly large share of Americans who are experiencing economic vulnerability, downward mobility, what this diagram refers to as economic peril, that is not really driving much increase in support for federal government spending. You would think it might, that the people who are most at risk economically would most support a strong federal government in order to provide a robust social safety net in the way that Americans did in the aftermath of the Great Depression in the 1930s. But in fact, the evidence is not very strong that that is happening. There's a very weak correlation between increased economic peril and increased support for the federal government. Whereas there's a much stronger correlation between level of racial resentment, ethnic antagonism and hostility, and decreased support for federal government expenditures. And we have talked about this in the past, the idea that the very people who might most benefit from increased federal government expenditure are also the people who are most likely to see the federal government as an agent promoting the fortunes, the social fate of African Americans, Latinos, Asians, immigrants over their own well-being, their own mobility, and therefore they do not support a more active federal government, despite the fact that they're most likely to benefit from a more active federal government. So to be as clear as possible, racial resentment is dragging down the support for federal programs, for increased progressive taxation, for increasing the minimum wage, for more robust healthcare on the part of the people who would most benefit from it. And McGhee is trying to suggest that's the paradox, the trap that racial zero-sum thinking pulls us into. We end up not supporting the policies that would benefit almost all of us, the bottom 90%, because of the divisions within the bottom 90%. And those divisions today are primarily racial. So having said that, I briefly suggested to you, drawing on the important new work of Ryan Enos and The Space Between Us, the way in which segregation shapes social cognition, supports stereotypes, supports political, social fragmentation, and gives rise potentially to a self-reinforcing process when we are geographically proximate to each other in large numbers, but segregated. We tend to reduce the other group and our own group to basic stereotypes that suggest our group is positive, their group is negative, as a way of sustaining our self-esteem, among other things. And then that leads us to think our group supports our party, their group supports their party, our group belongs here, their group belongs there, whether that's geographically in terms of neighborhoods or economically in terms of who works, who doesn't, who contributes, who doesn't, etc. And then Enos, I think, extremely important suggestion is that interpersonal contact, if it is regular and sustained, if it's not just running into each other in the bus or at the counter of the grocery store, but instead regular and of a kind that lets me slowly get to see you as a person, overcomes the negative effects of what he calls social geographic impact, that segregation of two large groups who are proximate to each other. And so he suggests, for instance, that Boston, there's much greater interpersonal contact than there is in some other cities that he studies. And therefore, the interpersonal contact in Boston is diminishing the effects of stereotypes and the way in which that generates group competition, especially among races in the United States. I've spoken with you before about Enos's train experiment, where he put two Spanish-speaking students on a suburban Boston train and found that their mere presence drove the white liberal riders of that commuter train much closer to Trump in terms of their politics for a little while, but that over time, actually, that reactionary trend went back to being less hostile to the newly arrived diversity, that over time we become less hostile to diversity. And I suggested to you that what we see in the United States almost uniformly is growing diversity. Almost every census tract in the United States saw an increase in the share of people of color. Very few saw an increase in the share of the white population. And so we should expect, in a sense, the United States to be going through a large version of that train experiment, or what Enos calls the Arizona effect. First, we become much more hostile to the diversity as we treat it as undermining our status, and group the newly arrived others together under cultural stereotypes. But slowly, as contact increases, we then diminish our stereotypes. And again, this is now the model that Enos is developing, strongly supported by the research that Heather McGhee did. And I want to suggest that McGhee is almost a 21st century Alexis de Tocqueville, that as de Tocqueville went to the United States to find democracy in action in the 19th century, so too McGhee is going local to find a new kind of democratic potential contained in 21st century America as a result of the way in which, in particular, our urban areas are becoming more and more diverse. And please note, when you look at this map, obviously there are large sections of this map that have seen very little growth in diversity. And there are some important areas that have seen countervailing trends, both growth in diversity and growth in areas that are actually increasingly white. And so this is not going to be uniform. And it certainly is going to roil our politics for, let us say, the next decade. Arbitrary number, but just to have some sense of how long this may last. But that on the far side of the period of transition, in which dealing with a more diverse, a genuinely multiracial America, the surrender of white Americans of their numerical majority in many areas already underway, it's not going to be gentle. It's not going to be nice. There's obviously a substantial and, in many senses, potentially violent reaction underway. But having said that, I do think that it is also the case that the long-term prospects for genuine interracial interaction, genuine multiracial cooperation in our society are growing as the diversity of our society is growing, and the evidence is already there on the ground in the case studies that McGhee presents us with. We also see some of this evidence in broader opinion research. It is the case that immigration is still a polarizing issue, but interestingly, over the last 5 or 6 years, it's become less of a critical issue as far as many Americans are concerned, right? And so Democrats have moved from being negative to being positive about immigration. Republicans have moved from being substantially negative, 10-1, to being less substantially negative, 2-1 about immigration. And I'm sorry, the Democrat figure is here, and they were positive throughout this 5-year period, but much more positive in 2020 than they were in 2016. These are the overall figures, which it shows the country as a whole has moved from being from being less to more positive about immigration. Similarly, and I'm sorry, I'm moving fast here. This is about diversification. Do you accept that diversity is a positive value? This is about immigration. And as you can see, similar kinds of polarization with a marked decline in white liberal hostility to immigration, a substantial decline in white moderate hostility to immigration. And really, it's only white conservatives who remain hostile to immigration. And so when I speak in these lectures about whites, I should be careful. European Americans, Americans of European descent, the people we categorize as white and who self-categorize themselves that way, are not uniform or uniformly hostile. In part, what we see in this broad-based opinion research, taking big surveys, is very much what McGhee sees in her case studies as well, which is that many white Americans are becoming much more accepting of the idea that our society is becoming increasingly diverse and that eventually white people will surrender their numerical majority, and with it, eventually, much of their privilege, certainly their monopoly on political power, which is characteristic of almost the entire history of our country. Similarly, as a result, we are becoming, many of us, less concerned about immigration, which might be seen as symbolic of the diversification. As I suggested to you last week, actually, most of the diversification is now internal, not driven by immigration, but driven by differential birth rates of people who are actually born into this country, of people already in this country. So to then get us fully to where we left off last week, I suggested to you that we have two models for the transition to multiracial democracy in America in the remainder of the 21st century. And please note, we've got nearly 80 years to go. I really think these trends will play out over the next 30 years. And on the one hand, we have the politics of maintaining white status superiority. And to be as clear as possible, this has become the politics of the Republican Party in the era of Donald Trump. And as we'll see in greater detail in just a moment, Donald Trump's control over the Republican Party appears to be very solid. And it appears that Donald Trump has given the Republican Party the at least potential for short-term electoral success, despite the long-term headwinds that a party that gets almost all of its support from white people, 90% of its support from white people. There's some opinion research that suggests that the Republican Party may be expanding its base slightly in terms of reaching out a little bit better to African Americans, to Latinos, to Asians. We will have to see, because frankly, that hasn't shown up in electoral politics yet. I'm not, in fact, confident that it will show up at any point soon, but at least there's some poll data suggesting the Republican Party is becoming a little bit less white. But having said that, it's not attracting a sufficient share of the rising demographic groups to win national elections unless it really motivates white status anxiety and suggests to white people that they absolutely need a party that is the vehicle of maintaining their power, or else they will be replaced, marginalized, become subordinate in their own society. And what McGhee helps us to see is the high collective costs of that kind of politics, of a politics of failing to cooperate across racial lines. And her evidence is simple, and across every major category of provision of public goods, whether we talk about educational expenditure, rates of educational completion, the level of student debt, rates of healthcare provision, the cost of healthcare provision, rates of public housing provision, or public subsidies for private home ownership, rates of job retraining, you name it. The US scores last or near last among the developed countries in the world. And her suggestion is that precisely the politics of divide and conquer, built on status competition, the idea that poor white people and poor Black and brown people, the middle class but newly vulnerable white people and newly rising middle class Asian, Latino, and African American people don't form a coalition around their shared economic, material, and social interests, because instead they're divided by status competition. That this is what explains the pathetic provision of public goods in our society, and hence the experience of vulnerability, downward mobility, precariousness of so many people in the bottom 60% of our income and wealth distribution. And she suggests, and here I'm not just drawing on Heather McGhee, I'm drawing also on a variety of other literature I've spoken with you about before. Arlie Hochschild's important work, Strangers in Their Own Land, Anne Case, Angus Deaton's important work on dying of whiteness, on deaths of despair. And I'm going to highlight in a moment Jonathan Metzl's work on dying of whiteness, that in particular, it is mainly white people who are paying the high costs of their unwillingness to engage in a kind of multiracial coalition building democratic politics. And so one thought about this is that over time, it becomes harder to vote against your own economic, material, social interests consistently. And so that in a sense, this kind of politics may be self-correcting. We can hope in the same way that the alternative kind of politics represented in Barack Obama's signature legislative accomplishment, the Affordable Care Act, is also self-reinforcing. Once the benefit is there, once people actually see it, see the good work that it does, see the way that it helps them, they become unwilling to vote against it. And this then opens the possibility of multiracial cooperation as an alternative model for 21st century politics. This is the model that McGhee finds evidence is already in place in many localities. And by the way, you may note that Stacey Abrams is running for the governor of Georgia, right? And this seems to be, among others, her model of politics. And McGhee points to Abrams' important work in voter registration, but also the way in which it's rooted in many local efforts at community building in Georgia that then result in voter registration drives and the success of Abrams' efforts. And so here the idea is that multiracial politics, a genuine coalition between white liberals, white working class people, African Americans, Latinos, Asians, all of whom stand to benefit from increased support for the federal government, increased taxation, increased progressive taxation, but also the programs that can fund increased regulation, that this kind of coalition could ultimately support a return of the kind of public policy initiative, call it a progressive public policy initiative, that was characteristic of the first half of the 20th century and that bore fruit in the middle and up until the last third of the 20th century. And so among the benefits of this kind of politics is not only that we get a much more robust provision of public goods, but also that people stop identifying their self-esteem in contrast to the lower social value they attribute to racial minorities. And that in many respects, a form of self-esteem that depends on saying, my group is better than your group, is almost always unstable, almost always haunted by doubt, because it's so implausible to think that all members of my racial group are superior to all members of your racial group. The evidence is quite clear that that's not the way that distinctions of worth, merit, social contribution work. There are people in my group that do a lot for our community, but there are also people in your group that do a lot for our community. And then there are people who don't do so much. They're divided between the two groups, not evenly across one group and the other, right? And so having a more honest and secure sense of self-esteem would be one of the benefits of multiracial social cooperation. Now, to turn quickly to Jonathan Metzl's work, and I'm just going to offer you a brief summary of a very good, interesting, important book. I recommend it to you. His book is called Dying of Whiteness, and he looks at 3 studies. And unfortunately, one of these issues is in the news again. He looks at gun violence in Missouri as a public health doctor. And so, right, Metzl is from Missouri. He teaches in the South. He's from a place that has a robust gun culture, but he notes as a public health doctor that there is a growing epidemic of gun violence, strongly correlated with the states that have liberalized their gun laws, and that the vast majority of people who die of gun violence are directly related to the gun owner. They're from the gun owner's immediate family. And in fact, most often it is the gun owner themselves who turns the gun on themselves, and that the ubiquitous availability of guns and the absence of any kind of safety measure with the guns has made it such that this is a standing temptation, right? And so if you find yourself in a moment of despair and you don't have the means of lethal violence readily at hand, the basic finding is that most people will navigate that difficulty and find their way clear to reaching out for help, getting themselves to a better situation, and continuing their lives. But if a gun is ready to hand, many people will use that gun on themselves. And this is part then of the phenomenon of deaths of despair, the shrinking mortality, the decrease in lifespan of white Americans is in part related to this kind of politics that says we are going to strip all regulation from guns. Similarly, he looks at Tennessee and he contrasts Tennessee and West Virginia, where they've had a expansion of the Affordable Care Act, where the result is that, for instance, if you need dialysis, you can get dialysis under Medicaid, which has also been expanded, or with health insurance supported by the Affordable Care Act. Whereas in Tennessee, where they have refused Medicaid expansion, where they've refused to set up Obamacare marketplaces, the result is that their mortality is going down and people are dying awful deaths due to the lack of access to the what should be state-of-the-art care that is increasingly available in the states that have expanded Medicare and taken full advantage of the Affordable Care Act. And again, Metzel is, uh, I think, very insightful in indicating, right, that many people who are resisting Medicaid or Obamacare expansion, who are supporting the liberalization of gun laws, see themselves as doing something that is noble, that is necessary, that is important in standing up for the individual against the incursions of the federal government. But they also recognize, especially in the case of refusing the Medicaid expansion, that they're doing something that is self-injurious, and that in a sense, they see this as a noble sacrifice that they have to make in order to resist the incursions of a federal government that is no longer on their side, but instead on the side of racial minorities, immigrants, liberals, big city people. Third case study is Kansas. And here you may remember the former governor had a longstanding policy of radical tax cuts, really, I think you would call it supply side economics on steroids. And the result is that the state government has had a substantial liquidity crisis, has been unable to pay for schools and other basic social services, has had to cut back again and again in the middle of a pandemic, right? And the result is that Governor Brownback is no longer in office, and Kansas is beginning, I hope, to put its house a little bit in better order. But nevertheless, again, this idea of radical anti-government politics, cutting underneath the government the very capacity for supporting itself through taxation, as a way of expressing mistrust of government and a kind of rugged individualism. As it turns out, this is decreasing life expectancy in Kansas. Essential services, providing people with subsidies for their heating over the winter, with support through food programs, etc., have been cut. And the result is that people are dying at a higher level in Kansas than they were before the Brownback tax cuts. And so Metzel offers an analysis of why and how this is happening, starting with the idea that the Tea Party and then Trump took what was a marginal kind of anti-government politics and made it mainstream national politics for one of the two main political parties. And so part of the story here is the way in which first the Tea Party, and please remember the way in which this was funded by the Koch brothers and others in their orbit, who poured hundreds of millions of dollars into what was supposedly a spontaneous grassroots movement, funding the insurgent challengers to incumbents within the Republican Party, radicalizing Republicans first in the House of Representatives in 2010, and then increasingly nationally, took this then marginal, mainly Southern form of politics, national, and gave it increasingly a hold over one of our two main parties. And that is then what gives rise to, or at least is the precondition for, Trump's ascendancy, takeover. I think in many respects, hostile takeover, but a hostile takeover of the Republican Party, the groundwork for which had been laid by the Tea Party movement. And the nationalization of the Southern local politics of vehement opposition to government funding, government action. And Metzel adds, and this is definitely reinforced by McGhee and others, that this trend is rooted in white racial resentment. And he analyzes it as a two-way phenomenon. It has a top-down component to it. It was led by the Koch brothers, by the organized Tea Party movement, but it was also very much finding fertile ground in the status anxiety generated by the downward economic mobility, the shattered expectations, the increased economic vulnerability of a large sector of the white American electorate, a group of people who were working class or formerly working class, who suffered from deindustrialization, who remained geographically primarily in the Rust Belt or in the South and rural areas, and who saw the United States moving in a direction that essentially left them out and were looking for a scapegoat to blame for their own loss of status and loss of economic security, and were happy enough to blame racial minorities. And then the Republican Party under the Tea Party movement, and increasingly, especially Donald Trump, gave them a legitimate path to vent that racial resentment. So the policies negatively affect the health of middle and lower income populations, right? That's what Metzel shows, I think, quite strikingly. And they tear down community structures without replacing them with viable alternatives. And I'll just point out to you that this is a major theme in Robert Putnam's work, which I will return to a little bit later. But it's not just that the policies undermine the economic viability, the access to public goods, they also contribute to increasing isolation, fragmentation, individualism, privatism, a sense of loss of community, and that can have very deleterious psychological effects. And finally, that these outcomes play into narratives of imagined victimhood, domination, honor, and sacrifice, that the white majority that has been the anchor of American democracy, freedom, the important role that American politics has played as the exemplar of a new form of government, a city on the hill in the world, that this is in danger as the white majority is in danger in American politics, and that therefore this group is making a sacrifice of its own interests in order to preserve the American experiment. When we look for the evidence of this self-injuring politics, right? This is the problem with the zero sum that Metzel and McGhee and others are helping us to see. I suggest that, right, the evidence is quite clear. We look at the provision of aid in the poorest areas in the United States, the so-called Bible Belt, right? We can see that they are substantially lower than most of the rest of the United States. And this is a feature of the way in which federal policy works in the United States, which is to say that the level of many of the programs that are poor relief programs are administered by the states, and the benefit levels are set by the states. And so as a result, the states can determine how generous they are. And as you can see, the areas that are most in need of assistance also set the aid at the lowest levels, right? Again, anti-government politics as a vehicle for expressing racial resentment, white status anxiety, resulting in damage to the very people who could benefit most from increased federal expenditure. In a sense, it's there for the taking in these states, but they do not provide it. And Kentucky provides us a particularly clear example of this. And you can see this as Kentucky has come to depend more and more on federal social benefits as an overall share of personal income. And you can see that it's more than doubled over the last 50 years. The support for conservatives who vote against these forms of benefits has increased remarkably, right? And so again, just to be as clear as possible, at some point, the self-injuring politics, we can hope, has to stop, that people will come to their senses and see the benefits that can be got from genuine cooperation, extending benefits. And this then takes me to this really quite bleak evidence of what this is doing. And this is the Deaths of Despair literature made popular, really. The path blazing work here is done by Ann Case and Angus Deaton, economists at Princeton University. And what you see is that there's a strong racial and a strong educational dimension to these deaths of despair. People who have a college degree or more are basically living the same or longer over the last 30 years. But people without a college degree, their life expectancy is actually going down. And it's going down because of increases in suicide, drug overdose, alcohol and alcoholism related deaths, and deaths associated with high anxiety, especially heart disease, right? And the findings here are especially pronounced with white Americans. And this is evidence that white Americans are feeling especially hard the threat to their status, to their sense of self-worth and belonging in our society, that the recent trends in economic vulnerability represent. African Americans are not experiencing the loss of economic security to the extent that has occurred for African Americans as nearly as threatening as white Americans are, because their sense of belonging depended much less on a sense of social differentiation, status, superiority. And so then when I come to the conclusion of this part of the analysis, at the base of all of this is what I want to call status anxiety, insecure, comparative self-esteem. My worth depends on thinking that I am better than you. And as more of your group rise into the middle class, rise into the elite, become more populous, the ability of me to sustain my sense of status, of self-worth by comparatively suggesting to myself that I am necessarily better than your group is eroded. You add to that the fact that I am experiencing downward economic mobility, and I become desperate to reassert my social superiority. And I'm doing that through self-destructive politics. So the historical background here is, and this is again coming to Putnam's story, that through the first half of the 20th century, a number of policies were put in place and a number of social and cultural developments occurred that allowed for a convergence of economic expectations in the middle of the 20th century, the Great Compression, the decrease in inequality, the rise of the middle class in American society, the growth of economic security and expectations of upward mobility, right? And that these required the equalizing experiences in the World War, the tremendous productivity of the post-war American economy, and the relative disempowerment of the hyper-rich that the Great Depressions and the World Wars, combined with the political threat of socialism, produced, and that this gave rise in turn to support for federal policy, favoring unionization, creating broad-based educational opportunity, first through universal public high school, then through the creation of the state university systems and the growing expectation that anybody who wanted one could get a college degree, through full employment policies on the part of the federal government and the Federal Reserve, through policies that sponsored home ownership, and through a relatively robust social safety net that protected people against the vicissitudes of a market economy, the vulnerabilities that the job market and economic cycles generate. And having said all of that, I think we also have to immediately notice that almost all of these policies benefited white Americans exclusively or to a much higher degree than African Americans. And we'll get into the complexities of that narrative next week, but there's a racially specific favoritism of these policies. And the result is that many white Americans came to think of themselves as deserving. We contribute, we work, we do our part, and therefore we deserve all these benefits and we get to take responsibility for how well we have done. And they came to think of African Americans who were excluded from all of the benefits of these policies, and increasingly Latino Americans and immigrants as undeserving, and to differentiate themselves, to put themselves above it. This is putting meat on the bones of the idea of that geographic separation, generating stereotypes. There was a high degree of geographic segregation in the United States and a high degree of cultural stereotyping that suggested white Americans were deserving and that poor Americans were not. And this has contributed to the historical amnesia and myopia about what actually gave rise to the growing middle class, the mobility, the increased economic security, the way in which it was these equalizing experiences and the policies that they made possible. And so this means that in the middle of the 20th century, there was a rearticulation of the notion of the wages of whiteness, this critical idea from W.E.B. Du Bois that there is a psychological wage that whites receive, especially poor and working class whites, that compensates for their lack of material wages. And that is in terms of honor, self-esteem, social status. And this then, when those expectations of economic security and differential social status are shattered in the first 20 years of the 21st century, toxic status anxiety takes hold. And this explains at the same time the declining life expectancy of white Americans and also the noxious politics of racial resentment that is undermining political cooperation. All right, so with all of that in mind, let me now focus on some interesting recent opinion research. And this is organized by a team organized by Michael Krauss at Yale University. And Krauss and his colleagues, including Jennifer Richardson, note the way in which perceptions of progress towards racial equality in the United States are wildly out of line with actual data. They do 3 studies of white Americans and ask them, how much progress have African Americans made in terms of the availability of governmental benefits to them, in terms of their ability to get higher wages by attending college or attending high school, in terms of their increased wealth and increased income. And what they find is that the vast majority of white Americans believe that there has been substantial progress in all of those dimensions, and that the actual data show that when we look at the period under question, and we're talking about from the 1960s to the present, there has actually been no progress. There has been regress in 4 out of 5 of these metrics. And in the 5th metric, the progress that has been made is much more limited than the progress that is perceived. Now, the explanation that Krauss and colleagues offered is summarized in the following quotation. He says, in essence, we contend that Americans engage in motivated cognition to remain willfully ignorant of racial inequality, right? Motivated cognition, meaning they pay attention to certain evidence. We've had a Black president. We now have a biracial vice president. We have Black elites, but not to the broader evidence about overall wealth and income distribution, or the stubborn persistence of high concentrations of inner city African American intergenerational poverty, right? We just don't cognitize this. We instead pay attention to the non-representative evidence that African Americans are making progress. So we have motivated cognition to remain willfully ignorant of racial inequality in general and racial economic inequality in particular, in service of our prevailing narrative of racial progress. Whenever dissonance emerges in this context, it is far easier to contextualize, rationalize, and or minimalize such inequalities than it is to change the prevailing progress narrative. Against the threat of potentially shattering this prevailing and persistent narrative racial progress, we argue people are motivated to explain away any evidence of stable, persistent racial inequality as noise rather than signal, at best as justifiable. Over time, this dissonance process leads people to selectively bring to mind and attend to high status rather than low status Black exemplars when asked to make inferences about racial economic disparities. The observed ignorance of the size of the wealth gap provides a significant challenge for any progressive economic policy. In short, if racial inequality is rapidly and even naturally decreasing over time, as the public seems to believe, then racially progressive economic policies have no basis for political support and no space in public discourse. Now, the relevance of this passage, this idea, in contemporary political discourse and in the context of this lecture, I hope is quite clear. This is part of what's sometimes called the justice hypothesis. We want to believe that we live in a just world, sometimes, called the just world hypothesis, because if we live in a just world, then we deserve what we have. It is our merit, our hard work, our good character that garners our social position. But having said that, there are 2 problems with this. The first is when your social fortunes decline, as they have for the majority of Americans, including the majority of white Americans, then if you believe in the just world hypothesis, you also come to believe that you are responsible for the decline in your fortunes, your social fate, your security, your likely economic mobility, your descendants' economic prospects. And the result is, of course, that you end up blaming yourself. And we see this in the deaths of despair literature, in the rising status anxiety of white Americans. A second difficulty associated with the just world hypothesis is it leads us to be blind not only to the injustice in our midst, to the clear and stubborn persistence of racial inequality, to the failure to provide equal funding for African American or Latino schools, for the way in which African Americans have been excluded from home ownership, etc. Right? It leads us not only to neglect that, but also to neglect the public policies that have led to economic security and mobility for people like us. We want to take too much individual responsibility and to fail to recognize the way in which public policy has backstopped economic security, economic mobility in America in the middle of the 20th century. And to return finally to the positive again. And let me see if I've got the slides for this ready to hand. Give me just a moment. When we look at the governmental policies being supported right now by the federal government, they represent a return to the more robust form of social provision that was characteristic of the United States at the middle of the 20th century. Now, to be clear, this is the Build Back Better bill that passed the House of Representatives a couple of weeks ago, but is still very much tied up in the Senate. We don't know what will become of it, but to be honest, I think what's more important than its social fate or its political fate at the moment is the priorities that it indicates. And to be clear, I do believe that part of this bill will pass, perhaps not all of it, the Senate, and then successfully be reconciled with the House. And the result will be a dramatic increase in help for families, in assistance for housing and healthcare for many Americans. And in particular, that this will be directed at those who are most vulnerable in our society. And I want to be clear about why this is happening now and why we should be encouraged by the emergence of a more progressive political agenda on the part of the Democratic Party, even if the short-term consequence of this is that the Democrats are going to lose power in the Senate and the House of Representatives in 2022. Please remember that something similar happened in the first midterm elections in Barack Obama's presidency, and has happened fairly uniformly throughout American politics for the last 70 years. That is to say, when a party gains the presidency in the next midterm election, it tends to lose power in Congress. But why, while the Democrats have power in Congress, are they enacting a progressive, expansive agenda, returning to the politics of something like the New Deal? And my short answer to that question is because the Democratic caucus within Congress is increasingly representative of the racial diversity of the United States and represents that multiracial form of cooperation which Heather McGhee is calling for. And as you can see, right, when we look at the racial composition of the Democrats in the House of Representatives, it's nearly 50-50 white people and people of color. This is then not as diverse as the American population as a whole in terms of overall representation in Congress, largely because the Republicans are nearly exclusively white, but because it's really only the Democrats that are doing this legislating, this is a genuine multiracial coalition. And the result is that they have a more accurate understanding of what is going to help all Americans. And again, as we saw with the Affordable Care Act, if these policies pass, if for the next 5 to 10 years, every family with children in the United States receives a $200 to $300 tax credit per month for their children, to lift them out of poverty, to lift them out of food insecurity. If we build greater public and subsidized private public sector housing in the big cities where the jobs are, if we increase the subsidies for the Affordable Care Act, et cetera, if we provide universal pre-K education, many of the poorer Americans are going to benefit most dramatically from these policies. And the result might be that policy feedback loop in which people slowly but surely start to prioritize their material or economic interests over their social identity, start to change their sense of social status so that it depends more on universal citizenship and less on racially particular factors. That, I believe, is the possible future for the United States. It's going to be a messy process of getting there, but I think we are seeing increasing signs that this is the direction a substantial portion of our population is moving, and it is already bearing legislative fruit at the local level, at the state level, and just now coming into focus at the national level. We may very well be beginning an upswing in American politics. Doesn't mean it's not going to be a bumpy ride on the way there. But I do want to emphasize this idea that I see in contemporary American politics, not only a lot that should distress and frighten us, but also a lot that should encourage and inspire us. I'll leave it there. I look forward to seeing you next week in person or live. Sorry for the pre-recorded lecture today. Gotta go to a wedding. Bye, everybody. Take care. Thank you.